work I'm doing there, which is proprietary. But I will be talking about something I'm not quite an expert on, so this should be more of a dialogue than me necessarily presenting. There's probably other people in the audience here that are more experts than I am, but I'd like to just kind of start dialoguing around this important topic. So this is all information that I was able to find basically on the internet. Just compiled it as a service to all of you. So the renewable fuel standard for 2012 was met for bio-based diesel back in 2010 for the annual production of 1 billion gallons of biodiesel in the United States, which is pretty, a nice thing to say that from almost nothing in 2000 to 1 billion gallons is pretty significant. So I'd like to talk a little bit in terms of, I try to standardize my presentation in terms of quads of energy. I'll be talking about global and the United States energy demand. And quads is a good standard. About 10 billion gallons of biodiesel is a quad of energy. It's a quadrillion British thermal units. I heard recently from Roger Prince, who's a British guy who works at Exxon, scientist at Exxon, so that it's embarrassing for the British thermal unit that it's only the energy in the head of a match. But a billion, so a quadrillion is kind of hard to imagine what is it. So about 10 billion gallons of biodiesel, so 10 times more than what the U.S. currently produced, kind of puts it into some type of scale. So right now, biodiesel produced in the U.S. is about 0.1 quadrillion BTUs altogether, is what we produce, approximately. So to put this into further scale, in the 1970s, the U.S. DOE did this aquatic species program report, which many people are familiar with. It said that algae could produce from 0.5 million acres, you could produce quad fuel, this would be basically another way to put in perspective. Instead of 10 billion gallons of biodiesel, this power plant is a Canadian power plant. It's 1,000 megawatts. It would take about 18 of these running all year long to equal 1 quad of energy on full bore. So that's also kind of neat because one of these power plants, a couple of these, is basically the amount of running all year round. Is basically the amount of vegetable oil that was converted last year to biodiesel. So that's a pretty significant accomplishment that a lot of people have put a lot of sweat and energy into. It's a lot of energy. This one was actually closed. That's a coal plant that was closed. So it's a positive thing. The way I like to think about it is Rhode Island. Google Earth right now has an issue. You can zoom in, zoom out, and it won't label Rhode Island for some reason. It's the smallest state. And about 500 million acres, there's less land than Rhode Island, our smallest state. So, imagine if you took the area of Pennsylvania in the Southwest or something like that. At this efficiency that's been reported by the Aquatic Species Program report, you could do a significant amount. So that, for 1 quad though, is a very small amount of total renewable diesel demand. At that time they said, I believe it was like 5% of diesel, but I think it's even less now. When you look at the total number of quads in terms of the energy density in 2002, biodiesel was really starting to get going. This is a complicated graph with a lot of inputs and outputs. But there's about 3.2 quads of biomass altogether, and the amount going into transportation was just 0.2 quads. But again, 0.1 quads is about what we're producing right now in terms of biodiesel. These other major imports, of course, are the fluxes of coal, natural gas, and petroleum. By 2006, we already saw some major differences, and this is all available online from LLNL and DOE. We do have 3.37 quads, not a whole lot more, but there's a bigger fraction going off to fuels, transportation. So you've got 0.48. So it's many fold increase from 2002 to 2006. Even though it's a small number, the fold increase is large. There's more flux that's going there. And then by 2012, so pretty current, the amount going to transportation is 1.16. So now you're talking about maybe an order of magnitude over the last. So it's small proportionally, but it's a large amount in terms of the amount we've changed that's happening. So I went ahead and took these charts and I went ahead and just plotted it for everyone's ease. And you see that the amount of biomass since then hasn't changed a whole lot in terms of the amount of biomass energy altogether. We used we use more natural gas now, and we use actually a little less petroleum. We use a little less coal also, about 5% less coal. And if you look at the percent, basically, in terms of the United States watts used of biomass, it's gone up over time to about 12% in biomass of the total energy usage. That 37 watts of us. And then you break that biomass down even further into the different places it's going, industrial, residential, electrical, you can see this increase. And so from 2002 to 2012, it's gone up to 26%. And it's a fraction of this total. However, a lot of this is ethanol. And that's what a major portion of this increase is. Going back to that 1 billion gallons of fuel being produced, and correct me if I'm wrong, because other people are probably more familiar with these stats than the more recent numbers. 1.28. 1.28, okay. But still, in terms of the major scales, tenfold and stuff. You're talking about maybe 30%, but if it's a tenth of that, it's basically then effectively biodiesel, and a lot of the rest being ethanol. So, in terms of the world reference case, for all the energy we use as humans, we're looking at it being in the hundreds of quads, basically, total energy. So it gives you an idea of the total, what we're actually looking at in complexity, where we want to get to with it. In terms of the petroleum reserves that actually exist, and what we predict, this is obviously a rough estimate. These are always changing depending on how much coal we can turn into methane and what is really there. But I've heard, I can't recall the direct source. I've heard that it's basically 4.5 meters deep in petroleum wrapping the entire Earth. I assume when they said this, they meant the outside circumference. It obviously changes. But around the whole Earth is about the amount of stored carbon we have under the ground over the hundreds of millions of years it's believed that was deposited. There's a very low rate of deposition of carbon right now relative to the amount that we're consuming. But if we're burning 500 quads a year, and these are in the tens of thousands of quads, you can see that we're going through it obviously at a much faster rate than was ever deposited, and the majority of the Earth's annual carbon emissions are clearly coming from the consumption of these petroleum reserves. So, basically I'm preaching to the choir here, I realize, but so, this seems like we are running through this pretty quick, but what's pretty amazing is that there's 8.2 million quads of solar energy available on Earth each day. So, I mean, that is pretty incredible that we have so much more solar energy coming in than we're actually storing. And this is where I spend my time in terms of my biological work, is trying to convert all this available energy into stored chemical energy most efficiently. And I think we can do this much more efficiently. Although the promises of the Aquatic Species Program are coming to fruition with native strains that people have been doing bioprospecting, the physics are still there to be able to harvest this enormous amount of solar energy that's coming in, and converting that efficiently into the land that we have and the resources that we have. That's a complex discussion I'm not going to go into too much. But if we are this capitalistic democracy, we have a choice of which source we're going to be able to use. And if you look, though, at the political opinion out there, and sorry, this is a little bit small, but when asked in this opinion poll from CNN, this is January 2013, which is the most important issue facing the country today. The economy was number one, and these were, by the way, the options were rotated in this. But the economy is 46%. People said the economy, and the federal budget deficit was next, and healthcare 14%. Immigration was actually higher than the environment, and 2% said that the environment was the biggest issue. Maybe without consideration that the environment, the ecosystem services, are upon which the economy and the healthcare and all of that depend ultimately in the long term. So that's an educational issue that we all know and have a responsibility to try to inform. Another poll, so this is one, not just a single poll, so another poll just in July from CBS. It's very similar. The environment was 3% of those polled, whereas 40% said the economy. Federal budget deficit was next, healthcare. So there's some parity there. So getting into the heart of the talk, switching gears, where does renewable diesel kind of fit into all this? And why am I interested particularly in renewable diesel as a biologist that wants to produce feedstocks for biological photon conversion into a fuel, a liquid highway transportation fuel? Because there's a lot of things that are happening right now, a lot of different types of catalysis, a lot of ways to convert plant and animal oils into what will run in a diesel engine, what will run in a jet engine, what will run in your bike or whatever. Like people are doing all sorts of different things, and they're giving these all sorts of different names. So what I understand from just looking around and talking to different people is that you have this broad category of renewable diesel, basically biomass-based diesel is how it's defined by the EPA, under which you have these subcategories, which you would include straight vegetable oil or recycled vegetable oil, waste veg oil, whatever you want to call it, biodiesel, which has a specific molecular structure, green diesel, which has become this name for these different hydrothermal or catalytic processes, which are not, basically anything that is not specifically a fatty acid methyl ester is what people are typically grouping in this green diesel. But I heard recently someone tell me, I don't have this source for this, that green diesel has been trademarked now. So I don't know if that's true or not. Saturated hydrocarbons, you can talk about thermal depolymerization, thermal hydrogenation. There's a lot of verbiage that's being used. So I just want to provide some clarity on this.
So, John,
yeah,
I just wanted to clarify. You're saying biodiesel exists as a subset of renewable diesel?
I'm saying that's one way that we could organize this. Because this is emerging, I wouldn't claim that you can say that's a absolute truth, but it's one way that you can organize this.
Are you going to talk about like the nerd versus FANE thing in here at all?
The what?
The nerd, like nerd, non-ester renewable diesel. Have you heard that?
I haven't heard that term, so I could add that.
So that's just a good one, where it's
okay.
Nerd versus FANE. It's non-ester renewable diesel as a subset of renewable diesel, and then biodiesel
right.
FANE as a subset.
So that's exactly the discussion I wanted to have here, is nomenclature about these different things, how we talk about it, which helps us communicate information, and then also what the implications for those different types are, at least a few of them.
Hey, John, please.
Yeah.
Can you just go back one?
Yeah.
Please. So would you, Jason, what would you consider nerd under here?
It's not really listed. Well,
but it would be all these things, all these four things, saturated hydrocarbon, surrogate,
yeah, I mean,
Because you couldn't consider SBO as
no, I wouldn't even put SBR beyond that. I think those are three things that should go out of the conversation.
Okay. There's issues with burning these things for sure, and they're not specifically one way the way I like to break it down is by the ASTMs. You have an ASTM for biodiesel.
Yeah,
you have an ASTM for these so-called NERs. And the other thing that's not listed here is
there is no ASTM specification for anything on that list except biodiesel, and that's been a position of the National Biodiesel Board, because the guys that are making green diesel would say we don't need an ASTM specification for E975, just like diesel fuel.
Well, let me pose this as a question I ask myself.
Yeah.
My question is, if it meets the ASTM does biodiesel meet the ASTM for diesel fuel? If you sent in some biodiesel, some fatty methyl ester to a testing lab to do the ASTM for diesel, would it pass?
Well, up to 5% biodiesel is included in E975.
Right. But it was. But if you took these products of green diesel or saturated hydrocarbons, the exception of having a slightly different isotope ratio of C14 and C13, and you sent them to a testing lab, you said, test this for the ASTM for on-road diesel.
Right.
They would likely pass.
If
they were low in sulfur, if they don't have cyclic molecules, they don't have side products, and they meet those specifications, they'll meet it. Just like Jet A. If it meets the specification for Jet A,
meeting the specifications that are outlined there, and meeting the full ASTM specification, because that ASTM specification was derived for petroleum diesel, so there's nothing in that list to catch other sort of contaminants or stuff that come from vegetable oils. So just because you meet the requirements for the E975 doesn't mean you actually meet the specifications.
Would it perhaps be better to call this biomass-based diesel, just form sort of?
Actually, yeah. Anyway, so this is ongoing dialogue. We're not going to solve it here right now. So that's for sure. They're all diesel surrogates. Yeah, the diesel surrogates made from biomass, but we want to call this the diesel surrogates made from biomass conference. So we can prioritize them, or and that's why we don't want to have diesel surrogates made from biomass magazine and so on. It's biomass-based diesel magazine. Biomass, does that mean that the actual magazine is made from biomass-based diesel polymers? Anyway, so the properties that are interesting that may be different about an alkane, about a diesel that's made, it's not a fatty acid methyl ester. There's good and bad things, right? There's way more than I'm going to list in the amount of time I have. But the idea is that if it were to have low sulfur and have the properties of a straight alkane and be clean, then it'd be compatible with existing engines, assuming it meets the operating temperature and those sorts of things. It does have reported in a recent Meuser paper. Sorry, I don't have the source here cited. That there's a slightly lower energy content in petrodiesel, but when burned in a diesel engine, there's likely to be a small difference in mileage. If you search, I think, renewable diesel or synthetic diesel in Van Derpen, he has online. There's many people that have been talking to me about that you can use isomerization to raise the octane to make it more suitable for gasoline engine, or it can further crack longer chains. So if you're using an organism that has like an oil or something that has 16 or 18 carbons, those may be too long for a cold temperature operation, or an algae for that matter. So the process can be modified. This is where the new science is going to happen, whether in the backyard lab or in a SBIR grant funded small company or at Exxon. Is it can be modified to achieve the necessary gel point in the blends that are produced. As far as I understand, it is approved for REN numbers. Some of the economics that I've seen, I couldn't find it actually recently, but some of the economics I've seen for from Biodiesel Digest on the plant that's going in which one is it? It's Louisiana.
Diamond green.
Yeah, the diamond green. That basically the RINs are the main factor in terms of making money. So this is going to affect potentially the price of yellow grease. These processes are going to be interconnected in economics. And then RINs are going to play a role in that, whether you are big enough to apply for RINs and acquire those, which there are many people in this audience that are more qualified to talk about that than I am. I'm just pointing this out and highlighting it. And I've also heard that they basically weren't required to pass the EPA required Tier 1 and Tier 2 health effects, which the Biodiesel Board have done for biodiesel. And so therefore, these are going to be sold under the ASTM D975 in the US and EN590 in Europe, is my understanding. So that would assume that although you could have problems with sulfur and nitrogen, which I believe, my understanding is a lot of these processes are used by refiners to actually clean things up away from sulfur and nitrogen, so it shouldn't be a problem. But if it meets the ASTM D975, my logic, correct me if I'm wrong, is that it should be as safe as diesel. Although diesel is a very heterogeneous substance, it may not be the best for an engine. Yeah.
So do you think that's why they're not being required to pass the EPA Tier 1 and Tier 2 health and human effects data?
Because it meets the existing standard.
That could have been the reason the lobbyists used.
It's interesting.
Got that out. I don't know if it is purely because of logic or purely because of lobbying.
Maybe not an answer.
I don't know. It's only speculation on my part. I agree with you that my guess is that they marched in there and said it's just like diesel fuel. It's not any worse than diesel fuel, so it should let us put it to market.
So in terms of looking at the chemistry of these varieties of bio-based diesels, you've got your FAME, and we all know that this reaction is more complicated. This is like producing FAMEs in heaven. You just mix the methanol in the base, and it produces your perfect. There's no soap. It just works perfectly. Of course, with enzymes, this might be more in the more perfect world with the help of nature. You don't have to worry about water as much and that sort of thing. The water that's generated from this reaction. We also know that, although on paper this works out with 3 moles of methanol, we have to use an excess, for instance, of methanol. And so what we see on paper in terms of how this thermal hydrogenation process might work, we know from our experience in biodiesel that it's likely to be a longer, tougher road, both at the bench as well as on the road. So the basic reaction for these different 2 types are kind of categorized into the Fischer-Tropsch, which you're going like solid. So the characteristic, the standard Fischer-Tropsch process is like coal to liquid, and there's a lot of coal in the world, obviously like 22,000 quads of coal underground. So that's a scary prospect, not to mention all the clathrates, the methane clathrates at the bottom of the ocean. So there's more there than we'd like to burn if we want to keep this Earth habitable. But the basic reaction is carbon monoxide. You break it all, whatever you're using, some solid biomass or coal, to carbon monoxide, react with hydrogen to get hydrocarbons. That's the basic idea. Of course, it's obviously going to be much more complicated than that. It's an oversimplification. But with thermal hydrogenation, you do an anaerobic reaction, which is an important point if you're reading this at a bench scale. You don't want oxygen in there because you're at high temperature mixing hydrogen in the presence of a catalyst at high temperature and pressure. So you have the fuel and hydrogen mixed together, and that's why this is not recommended as a batch process, for a home brewer or a small-scale producer. But the basic reaction is you're mixing your triglyceride with 6 hydrogen, You get propane, 3 alkanes, and CO2. This is obviously not going to be the case. You're going to get a lot of side products from this. This is why coupling to a large refinery is ideal, because they have distillation columns from which you're going to get the side products recycled in. There's already side streams for these to go to. But hypothetically, with optimization, you know, what I'm questioning is, could this be an alternative process at a small scale? And could we drive it to more completion by using the excess of hydrogen and by pulling off the side products and recycling those? Bring it back into the pot. So one major consideration, yeah?
You said something that was interesting. So they can take coal now and turn it into this green diesel.
Yeah, China's all over it, is what I understand. So and that's where, you know, we have an imperative to
Wasn't this whole process designed back before World War II in Germany?
I don't know the exact history of the
Fisher
first
tropes
time.
and that stuff's been around a long time.
It's been around a long time.
Gas or something.
So the boiling point is, so one question I had is, okay, I hear different things. Straight 16 is going to be fine for as a diesel surrogate. The thing is so if you get down to 14 chains, your gelling temp, which is this blue line here, is around 14 degrees C. That's, you know, or I'm sorry, at 14 at the 14 carbon chain, it's at 0 degrees C. But up to 16, which I thought was going to be just fine, actually may be troublesome in cold weather climates to be a perfect diesel 2 replacement. However, this is why people talk a lot about isomerization, which is kind of a vague catch-all for a lot of side processes in which you would end up with more branched alkanes or mixed with other shorter alkanes, that sort of thing. So there's going to be some optimization, obviously, in terms of how this runs in an engine and what other solvents it would have in it. Again, petroleum diesel is a heterogeneous mixture of different branched forms, and even the cetane standard is a branched molecule as well as the octane standard. So I'll just go into some of the major players in the renewable diesel market. You know, you have the Brazilian company, which I don't know too much about. There's been a lot more talk about Neste. They are driven by this EU mandate for 10% renewable on-road fuel by 2020. And they have 4 plants, 2 in Finland, 1 in Singapore, 1 in the Netherlands. And they have this next BTL fuel, which they claim reduces greenhouse gas reduction 40 to 90%. I don't know what percentage of the time they're at 90% and what other percentage of the time they're at 40%, because their palm oil as a whole is 64%. And being co-located in Singapore and places like that, you have to wonder a little bit about that and about the feedstock, what that means. And some consideration, which is where you so much complexity to this issue around renewable diesel, what you're getting, what it means. Diamond Green is a collaboration between Valero Energy and Darling Griffin. They're just starting to fire up. They claim their plant in Louisiana could suck up 11% of the U.S. animal fat and use cooking oil. So that's simple economics that if you decrease the supply, you're going to increase the price. Similar things happened in 2007, increase the price of yellow grease and make it harder to do a traditional biodiesel process with the cost of methanol, getting a good driver, all these other important things that are part of the whole process, and still be able to turn a profit. So, you know, these are the kind of examples of major efforts that are going to potentially impact the biodiesel community. Tesoro is in agreement with Sapphire Energy. We're talking about kind of a small amount. It's not really been stated how much, but I found one article where they talked about basically right now they're producing about 2 barrels of oil per day out of their New Mexico facility with their algae farm. So this is a small scale proof of concept. But this is where you start. Things are actually happening. They should probably try to sell a gallon to Lyle to get a little more profit.
I just wanted to make a comment about this idea of crude. One of the problems with producing a drop-in replacement fuel is you don't create all the other things that are the side streams of the barrel. So some of these companies are producing green crude, which can then have all the other side streams, like the little trace elements of all the real light molecules. And because there's such an established supply chain for those and a needed place for those to go, if we replace all the diesel with renewable diesel, then there'd be suddenly a shortage of all those other things, which would create some other crazy market things. So a big thing in my research at RSB was who's making what. Some of these are making green crude, which I think is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is interesting. But then the question arises, if you're going to produce a very complex mixture of things, Are you suited? Is this a suited for a small scale process? And does that fit the desire of people that are currently involved in the biodiesel industry and market, is taking control of not only making it ecologically viable, but having a system an economic system which supports small industry, small businesses, and brings that capital back into their community. So that's a big part of it as well, and what fraction we can do with that. So there's another company, which is actually, there's a representative here, Brandon, in the audience. Yeah, ReactWell is a biomass-based synthetic oil. They're building a pilot facility in Louisiana, and they're just starting up, getting the process going and learning about the process and looking for funding for that. Cobalt is a company that's doing it a little bit differently. They're in class of higher lubricity, and actually can prolong the life, I understand, of the injector pump because it has a higher lubricity. So yeah, then it comes down to these specialty blends, and that's where knowing exactly what we're producing, if we are to produce this on a small scale, if you know exactly what you're producing and all the implications, all the way from the field to the engine, and that's what kind of organization we are at CBC, is we bring in people from all different walks of life that have different specialties to kind of to bring together all these different parts in a very complex process when you're talking about a totally integrated system that's community driven. It takes very different, widely different expertise to do this.
So to follow on Lisa's point, if all the engines are being built around the petroleum spec for the product that was made in the past, and there's an expected increase in the bio-based product, don't engine manufacturers need to start getting on board and admitting that biofuels are going to be a larger part of the mix in the future, and they need to design engines that will work with biofuels, meaning particulate filters that ban biodiesel are a horrible idea long term.
Yeah, it's kind of dialectic though. It's like, and you could argue that you're going to be stuck with petroleum for years to come because there's plenty of it here. I've heard that argument as well.
Right.
So
well, for the jet fuel, these fleets are often 50 to 75 years old, but they have to have fuel for it. The vehicles can let that fleet consume faster.
But if we're building new jet engines now that are built on a petroleum spec, that requires petroleum junk left in there, that means for the next 75 years, those planes are going to have to fly on the same crap fuel we've been dealing with forever.
But if you go back to it, the thing is too, is I don't think that any of us are going to be homebrewing some jet fuel. So for now, we have enough. We go back to those quad charts. We're talking about our 1 billion gallons being equal to 0.1 quads. And so I actually was talking to John Bush, and I were hanging out last night. I was saying we should have the 1 quad challenge for the conference. We're the first one to make 1 quad of biodiesel in some award. All you have to do is make 10 billion gallons in a lifetime, and you'll make 0.25% of 1 year's of the world's consumption. Now, if you spend the next 100 years doing that, you can amortize that out over the consumption. So a lot of people that know these values are going to say, okay, biodiesel is an interesting boutique thing. You can trade your ecological guilt for salvation by getting greasy. But really when it comes to making massive change, the companies that are keeping people healthy, getting food on the table, providing fuel for those center pivots to run those farms are the people that are getting that oil out of the ground. Is going to be their response. And then, we can argue about jet fuel and this and that, but really it's going to come down to supply and where we're going to get the actual lipids to become a significant force. We use the same amount of feedstock to make renewable diesel, other types of renewable diesel versus biodiesel. It's kind of inconsequential. You're playing with such a small amount.
But I would also point out that there's a few different pathways. Some of those new companies are doing like CO2 and salt water and air. Like there's a company called Joule that's doing that.
Right.
And then some of them are doing sugars, to fuel, even sugars to cellulose and diesel.
And that's where the trophic levels are important. So if your sugarcane efficiency is at 1%, and then you have a conversion efficiency that's 5% or 50%, then you're still at 0.5%, which is you're in the corn ethanol realm. So you're not at $4 a gallon. Yep.
I just feel like this conversation kind of reinforces the idea that this is really a feedstock game for any energy producer. And in the future, we're going to have like this buffet of technologies in front of us, and it's really going to be which you choose based on what your specific goals and needs are. but
Right.
we're always going to be going after the very same feedstocks. And that's,
I disagree with that. That's what I'm saying is, yeah, I mean, in all this research I was doing for the RFP, as to biomass, like this.
oh, but I would include that when I say always going after. Like, there's a pool of feedstocks that is already sought by various industries, and that's going to continue to be where all of the advanced promise for any of these renewable fuels is going to be.
All right. So let me just get through the last one. Dynamic fuels is that, if you've heard about this collaboration with Tyson, that's the Centrolium. People are trademarking all kinds of names like synthetic diesel. I'm particularly a good fan of synthetic diesel. I don't know if synthetic genomics will want to trademark that, but I think synthetic is neat because it's, it's not, yeah, there's one way to say it. But the future of FAMEs and saturated hydrocarbons, so this is kind of getting into what you're saying, Kumar, is that in the future we're going to have this buffet of different options, but we need to be able to have a conversation about them. We need to have a nomenclature about them where we can discuss them and talk about all the different aspects of each one, because there's going to be different flavors of the political, ecological, and engine characteristics of each one. So we're basically talking about FAMEs and saturated hydrocarbons from real-time solar carbon fixation, which is what we're all really interested in, is turning the largest source of energy on the planet efficiently into something we can use as a liquid fuel, high density, and run on the road at an efficiency that we can displace petroleum at a greater and greater amount. Alkanes have different fuel characteristics, and their synthesis from vegetable oils has yet to be scaled to a proven and safe method for the home brewer, cooperative, or small producer. I think this is pretty fair to say. There may be some bench scale stuff. Some of the studies I've read that are journal article based studies are sealed containers, high pressure temperature, with all the reactants. They pull it out and they get a certain percentage of efficiency, and they measure what's produced. This is obviously not a production system. So what I'm talking about is the development of a continuous flow reactor with small volumes. So you have less probability of this danger from this exothermic reaction involving hydrogen, the production of propane and hydrocarbons. And so thereby you can eliminate the danger for small producers to test these reaction variables, the downstream processing, and their engine characteristics. So I'm kind of proposing maybe writing an SBIR, working with some of the people involved with this conference, to basically do what we do with HPLC, use a gear pump to just pump in a small amount of fuel, mixing in directly at the point of injection with a stoichiometric amount of hydrogen in an anaerobic lipid supply, and then pushing it through a column of catalyst at a temperature that's defined, and then basically seeing what we get out the back end, using the same kind of expertise we have, just that we've studied biodiesel all these years, and the expertise we have to collect and try to model and attempt to do some of these reactions. I think we have the brain trust in this organization to do that. So then we can compare the cost, and some of the people that are here also that are already running and involved with companies doing this, compare the cost and efficiency data from transesterification. We have plenty of data on that from the people that are here, and metal oxide catalysts, which Todd was talking about yesterday, with some of these other emerging processes, and see if there's a benefit and whether it's even possible. And then, basically the bottom line being the process selected to make renewable diesel should be based on the efficiency and what's the desired outcome of the products that are produced, which is reiterating exactly what Kumar was saying as we go forward. And we have to, work together to educate ourselves. So basically, the last thing I just wanted to touch on is the nomenclature, how to talk about this. There's been some discussions online and stuff about this, and this confusion around renewable diesel, whether renewable diesel is this overarching, or bio-based diesel is this overarching category, of which biodiesel is one type of renewable diesel. And when naming these on tanks and that sort of thing, if you're making a blend, one concept is with diesel, I've seen diesel written as 1-D or 2-D. So you could have 1-B be recognized as biodiesel. And that would be 1-B100, for instance, if you're running just straight fatty acid methyl esters. And then if you had a biomass-based renewable diesel, so again, it's still a B, it's biomass-based, you could use 2-B. So then you have 100% renewable diesel from Tyson, and you're running that in your truck. Then you've got 2-B100. So on a tank that says a B20 blend of FAME and renewable diesel, you would just call it 1-B20 and 2-B80. So it's a really simple way to denote what you've got in your tank. What's going on to eliminate confusion. Just as an idea, just to throw out there. Because we need to have some dialogue about how to discuss this, how to talk about it. I think that would just cut to the chase, make it simple. Now you might now get into, you want to get into greater detail about what is this 2-B80, is this palm oil, is it made of orangutans, or what is this?
At some point it doesn't matter, right? Like at some point we're filling it out, the consumer at some point just doesn't care, right?
Yeah, well,
I mean, certainly down the supply chain, there's a lot of people that care, but
that would be one argument made.
Really, most of the people that fill up their car do not care. They just want it to work.
Right, and that is true.
So once you got your chain of orangutan fuel and palm fuel and et cetera, it's going to kind of lose its.
And I don't know if that's always true because we do have the ability to transmit information really quickly. I think it would be really easy for Yokayo to inform their customers, or Diesel Green to inform their customers. And he's actually, Jason talked about this, that he goes to restaurants and talks about whether we're selling to renderers or whether we're actually making biodiesel. It makes a difference to the restaurants. And I even see this when talking to restaurant owners in San Diego. They want to get involved. They want to know what's happening with their oil. And the consumer likewise, I think people will be interested to know this is sourced from 200 local restaurants. Your renewable diesel is sourced from 200 local restaurants, or it's grown from a camelina farmer out in eastern Colorado during the winter months when he can't grow his normal crop, his alfalfa, during the summer. That connection has already been proven in marketing to work well for consumers.
It works very well for organic foods and farmers.
Yeah, exactly.
The story, especially coffee.
So it fits the cooperative market really well. If you can make a blend in Chicago that works in winter months that's 20% soy, 80% renewable diesel that's made from restaurants.
As a boutique fuel, that sounds fun.
Initially, but the thing is the things we learn about renewable diesel that we will tie into small-scale farm fuels from algae is going to build on the foundation of the organizations that we have created. And that's the other part of it, is the other part of biodiesel. It's not just about the reaction, it's about the people and learning how to do it, finding the right driver. And there is going to be an increase in supply. I just came from a photosynthesis conference, International Photosynthesis Conference, and I'm completely convinced that we are going to have an increase in feedstock. People aren't super patient. They're like, hey, we heard about this in 2002. It's 10 years later. How come all the problems aren't solved yet? And on geological timescale, I mean, it's not a big. It's been 10 years, folks. With a little patience, the physics work out, and the amount of solar energy we have works out. Now, someone asked me about fertilizer and demand, and I kind of had to school myself. So I went home and I looked it up, and there's been one study where they said that the amount of nitrogen to grow a crop, they said just for 5% of our diesel supply would be, I think it's like, don't quote me exactly, but it was above 50% of the global nitrogen for our crop for the United States. Now, on the other hand, most of the process people that are working on algal biofuels know that, and they're looking at recycling nitrogen. There's no nitrogen in lipids, right? And so there's no phosphorus in lipids. And so that study didn't involve recycling those nutrients. And so it always takes a critical eye when you're looking at these studies to think about what's possible. Can you couple nitrogen fixation to it and use it actually as a green fertilizer and actually have a positive stream? Can you make protein and have that as a positive stream from the production of algae? So the things we're learning right now as a community, it may be boutique right now, it may be small, but there may be a greater relevance in terms of we're setting the foundation for what can be revolutionary fuels that we produce, sell, and use in the United States, all small businesses. Yeah?
I think the point you brought up about nitrogen and sustainability of agriculture is really interesting, because that's one of the questions we do get in biodiesel industry, is what's the sustainability of feedstock production. And I'm glad you pointed out that there's no nitrogen in biodiesel, there's no nitrogen in vegetable oil. It's carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen that all get harvested from the atmosphere. So the sustainability of recycled nitrogen is really an issue for the food production system, because that's where the nitrogen goes. It goes into the amino acids and the protein part of the crop. So
some would argue, though, that the produce of biodiesel from terrestrial crop plants is basically mining, because the amount of soil that we lose due to the farm production of these crops. And there's also, of course, the food versus fuel argument.
What I'm suggesting is that biodiesel is a formula that, if they can figure out the sustainability of food production, we can come along for the ride. We can harvest energy from the elements that are harvested or recycled from the atmosphere, the energy from the sun. So that sustainability of nitrogen fertilizer is really that's on the food side of the equation. And that should really come first. Society needs to establish the sustainable food production. And biodiesel will probably usually be in that niche of using the byproducts of food production.
Yeah. But that will never make up a substantial, the byproducts of food production will never be a substantial portion of our energy demand at the current consumptive rate. There's never going to be as much food produced that will equal the byproducts of oil. The sheer amount of ethanol corn crop that's being grown right now is a perfect example of that. And that comes down to the actual energetic efficiency of growing a plant that has leaves and stalks and that sort of thing. A lot of energy is going into that. Yeah.
Actually, if you take a step backwards, you've talked about lipids, which come from algae or other sources, but if you step back, the 500 quads we were talking about compared to the 8.2 million from the sun, all of this is basically just translating solar energy into a usable form for humans, but this is the path of biologic liquid fuel generation. The other path could just be sun directly into electrons. If you looked at comparison between how effective in the long run
okay, so that's
solar
that's
electric compared to liquid storage.
So the best solar panels are 20% efficient, 20 to 25% efficient. You consider an electrolyzer as being a pretty efficient conversion of that at 70%. You're then down to 11% efficiency. But you're talking about harvesting using rare earth metals like gallium and platinum, palladium, these kinds of rare earth metals that aren't as available. So biology uses widely available metals like iron and sulfur. However, if you could, of course, make structural analogs using these more abundant metals, that's obviously something. And that's, again, something that this community, because of the interest in converting photonic flux into a fuel, is still be prepared to embrace, and I think should be prepared to embrace it and provide to the consumer if that were viable. That's why I think if we have to, the equal playing field is really the sustainability aspect of it, how sustainable each concurrent process is.
To me, it seems like the most important thing for our little world is not so much making it at a small scale, maybe that's because I don't need biodiesel, but it's the blending. And like those of us that sell B100, but we know there's a huge market for B20 that don't want to deal with it. How do we get our hands on renewable diesel? Who's producing it? That's great that you put that list out there. We need to be calling those companies and saying, I'm in Austin, how can I get a tanker load? And then also the naming, something we really need to address. Frankly, I think that's a little overcomplicated because that allows for every possibility. Your naming system at the bottom. I'd like to see a name of something. The most likely thing to use is going to be B20. It's going to be 80% renewable. B5 is already covered because it's in the diesel spec. And I don't really see a lot of like novel blending in between, at least probably not very often. If we could just come up with a name that is B20 with the other 80% renewable diesel.
So B20 isn't clearly defined as a 20% biodiesel, 20% petroleum diesel.
20%. I'm not following you, sorry.
B20 is not already defined as a 20% biodiesel, 80% petroleum diesel spec.
It is. I'm saying we need a name for 20% biodiesel, 80% renewable diesel.
Like R20 or something?
Yeah, RD20 or something that, that we can, and I don't say we got to come up with it today, but this is going to be for us to really improve our markets, or, grow our markets. We've got to be able to say something that has a logo and a stamp, and maybe it's NBV that's going to come out.
So if it's like 2% renewable, 2% diesel, 96%.
No, I'm just saying. You're allowed to. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. There's one, and it's B20 with 80% renewable diesel. I know that I'm looking at that. I know Kumar's looking at that. Imagine other people are looking at that too. That's like an easy one. Without all the other, well, what if you did this, what if you did this? Because that one, B20 with 80% renewable diesel. I want to sell that and market it, but it needs a logo and it needs a marketing plan and it needs support from the industry. And I don't mean just you guys, but it needs like NBV needs to say this is a B20 with 80% renewable diesel. That needs to be defined. I mean, 5 years from now, I'm certain we'll be talking about. Remember, we didn't know what to call it. Now here's what we call it. So someday somebody's got to come up.
How do you feel like the pricing is going to be on that?
My concern too is that what we see is the logic. If it's not pushed for, what's the logical answer? Then there's going to be other reasons why. Like for instance, if you're making a lot of renewable diesel, say you're a huge company making a lot of renewable, but you want to emphasize the part of it that's not biodiesel. You want to emphasize that. You may want to have a naming system
that RD80
that specifically emphasizes that renewable portion and stuff. John, you have some?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like what you were saying. I mean, I would argue that, you know, regardless of what the consumer thinks, it is important to figure out this naming scheme because, you know, if you have one biological-based diesel fuel that is biodiesel that meets that specification, you have this other biological-based diesel fuel that meets a different specification. They have very different properties. You know, regardless of, you know, like the consumer might be like, oh yeah, biological-based diesel, I want to put that in, but you know, there's implications on, you know, how it's going to perform in the engines. You know, there's, you know, you hear all this discussion about, you know, diesel particulate filters and the, you know, cleaning cycles on those and how it works with biodiesel or how it doesn't work with biodiesel. But then you have this other thing that maybe does work. And so engine manufacturers are going to, you know, as this grows, they're going to be coming up with specifications of what they allow in their cars. And consumers may or may not pay attention to that. But the people that are selling the fuel, the people that are making the cars, and the people that are working on the cars that are breaking down because of consumers not paying attention are all going to be players in that. So it's certainly important to figure it out, I think.
And people are just going to be confused. The public knows biodiesel to some degree. I think that the public is just going to get confused.
Yeah, it's going to be confusing, but you know, it's like we're entering an era where this is what we have to do because as we run out of conventional fuels, you know, more and more of, you know, different types of sources of fuels are going to be produced, and we're going to have to use them, and people are going to have to figure it out.
People are going to want to ask Jason, is my vehicle, new vehicle I just bought, is it, you know, 1B20, 2B80 compatible?
Let me ask maybe Don a question. First of all, is the word biodiesel trademarked or protected in any way?
Yeah.
By whom? Is it MDB? Okay. So if a renewable producer, if I sell a B20 that another 80% is renewable diesel, now that the renewable diesel camp is under, you know, under the Big Tent, is it possible that I could say it's 100% biodiesel?
No, it's not because of the trademark for it, it's because we've got 48 states that define biodiesel as the ASTM specification.
Okay, well that's a good
point.
And all of this is assuming that there isn't anyone intentionally trying to deceive consumers, because when you say biodiesel as one word, you're talking 6751, right? That's what the trademark word means. It's past ASTM.
Right.
But if you just write it as bio-diesel, doesn't that I mean, aren't you going to run into people who are intentionally trying to...
It also has to come from either a vegetable or animal fat source. I mean, it's not just the specification, it's also the source of the fatty acids.
The states do define it usually as that.
Yeah, it's like these types of fatty acids derived from these sources that meets the specification. That's the definition.
Randy, I'm sorry.
So I just want to know, Kumar, did you find anyone that was willing to give you some renewable diesel?
It appears that I have, yes.
Cool.
I am looking forward to providing the first commercial B20 that's fully renewable.
Do you have any pricing yet for incoming at a smaller scale?
All I'm doing at this point is exchanging what our expectations are as far as volumes. I'm looking forward to getting pricing, but you know, we're targeting having this within a few months. I really should stop saying timelines because it always works out bad for me.
If you follow the pace with the cellulosic ethanol people, it's okay. You should still do that. It's always a year away, but I'm sure that you'll be getting it, you know, soon. But I think it'd be great to try to demonstrate a small-scale production system in column, a continuous flow column. So that's kind of my appeal or my request is if anyone's interested in a project like that, get in touch with me.
Did you say maybe small-scale renewable diesel?
Yes.
Yeah, I've got some resources on that.
Okay.
Contacts in Kentucky that have taken a catalyst that is a less of a rare earth metal. It's more common catalyst. The materials are more commonly available, and I'm happy to share.
Okay. Because I've currently been working with a new startup, a lab startup called Biotech and Beyond in the San Diego area, which is an incubator. And I would love nothing else than to get some funding to set up a bench scale and test some different catalysts.
I can help you out with SBR.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Yeah, I just learned about the whole DUN system, the SAM registration, and all that.
I know it.
And
back of my hand.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. And actually, providing materials for other people that want to do that would be great. I'm actually working on maybe producing a presentation on applying for SBIRs based on my experience, and I'd love to work with you on making that more presentable for other people that guide on how to do that. Because it is ridiculously complicated. And confusing. Yeah.
Just a little more perspective on the naming. I have seen publications in Europe from today where they actually use the biodiesel name. So in a sense, that's sort of flattering that they think biodiesel has a positive image, and that's preferable to what we see from some of the other companies like UOP, where in an effort to market their product, they say bad things about biodiesel. And I tried to discourage them from that, not the fact that they don't listen to me, but my opinion on that is that the consumer is not going to know the difference. The consumer's not going to keep it straight. So if you tell them that one form of renewable diesel is bad, they'll just like, well, I can't remember which is good, which is bad. I'll just use petroleum diesel and not worry about it. Petroleum diesel is really the competitor. I mean, biodiesel and renewable diesel, we compete for feedstock, but we don't compete for market share. We're in the same little pool that competes against petroleum diesel. So,
Kumar, you should just call it straight bio. It's just straight bio, man. Like, it's mixed, it's a blend, but it's basically straight bio.
so
But it's not.
That's chaser.
I mean, this time next year, we should probably all be talking about our efforts to sell renewable diesel blended with biodiesel and what we're telling our
Actually,
customers.
down where I live, I think we can just run straight fames just fine for a little while. But I recognize the potential.
I'm talking about customers, new customers, not converting the old customers from B100 to this new thing.
No, I run B20, but I want to start working on. That's a whole other project, but getting some clients in the San Diego area.
Well, that's a good point though, because I mean, if the biodiesel community really starts marketing this 80% renewable diesels, it would, it's kind of like what you were saying, it would show that, hey, we're supporting, this whole effort.
Well, if you talk about the carbon footprint, say, B100 has lower carbon footprint, might have compatibility issues. It's a longer conversation, I think.
But it's the future, and I think that it's really important to recognize that as biodiesel pioneers, a lot of us have been really attached to, wedded to, addicted to high blend B100 stuff. That's our baby.